The dare was Priya's idea, because all the worst ideas in Nadia's life had been Priya's idea. They were standing at the tree line of the Velneth forest at 11:30 on a Friday night, the kind of cold that got into your collar and stayed there, and Priya was holding her phone up for light and grinning with the specific energy of someone who had consumed 2 glasses of wine and 0 consequences so far. The forest pressed against the edge of their university town like something that had been there first and was simply waiting for the town to stop pretending otherwise. Old growth. The kind of trees that had their own weather system underneath the canopy, their own darkness, their own logic. Everyone in Velnath knew the story. It was the kind of story that got told at freshman orientation as a joke and at midnight in dormitory rooms as something less funny. The forest had a name that did not appear on any official map. The locals called it Caldermore, which translated approximately to the place that answers back, and they said it with the particular tone of people describing something they had decided was folklore because the alternative was more than they wanted to carry. The story went like this. There was a name. An old name. Older than the town. Older than the records. Written in the oldest surviving document in the university library, in a script that 3 separate linguistics professors had declined to definitively identify. The document described a sovereign of the forest territories, a figure that predated written memory, and it gave the name that was his true one, the one that had power in it, the one you were not supposed to say. Students dared each other to come to the tree line and say it every few years. Nothing had ever happened. Obviously, nothing had ever happened. It was a story. Go on then, Priya said, shining her phone light at the trees. Say it. Nadia was 22, finishing her final year of folklore studies, which was either the most or least appropriate background for this moment, depending on how the next 30 seconds went. She had spent 4 years reading about liminal spaces and the logic of transgressive ritual and the specific cultural function of forbidden names in pre-modern European traditions, and she knew, intellectually, that the name in that document was almost certainly a corrupted transcription of a regional dialect term for forest spirit, generalized over centuries into a proper noun through the usual process of legend formation. She also knew that she had been reading about Caldermore specifically for her thesis for 8 months, that she had spent more time with that document than any other researcher in the university's history, and that there was something about the name on the page that had been sitting in the back of her mind like a stone in a shoe. A quality to it she could not academically account for. The trees were very dark. Nadia took a breath. She said the name. She said it the way she had been reading it in her head for 8 months, with the vowel length and consonant weight that the original script suggested, the way a linguist said a word rather than the way a tourist did, with the specific intention of producing the actual sound rather than an approximation of it. Kadron, the forest went quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of wind dropping, a different quality of quiet, the kind that arrived when something very large stopped moving, the kind that had presence in it. Priya's phone light flickered. Both of them registered this without speaking. Then, Priya laughed, the sound too loud and too fast in the sudden quiet, the laugh of someone covering something with noise. See, nothing, Priya started. Something moved in the trees, not the something of an animal, the something of intention. Specific, directed movement that came from the interior of the forest toward the tree line with a speed that did not belong to any animal Nadia could name. She felt it before she heard it, a change in the air, a pressure that had direction. She turned. He was standing 3 feet behind her. This was not possible. She had been facing the forest. She had seen nothing approach. And yet there he was, between her and the trees, having come from a direction that did not account for physics as she understood them. Tall, very still. Dark clothing that seemed to have been chosen specifically for the quality of disappearing against nighttime. hair that was dark and long enough to be pushed back from a face that was, she had no word for it. She was a person who worked with words, and she had no word for it. The face of something that had been present long enough to stop performing youth, that carried its age the way old stone did, in density rather than decay. His eyes were on her, not on Priya, who had made an involuntary sound behind her and was now very still. On Nadia, with the specific attention of someone who had heard their name spoken correctly for the first time in a very long time, and was now looking at the person who had managed it. "You said my name," he said. His voice was low and even, and had that quality of being more present than the space it occupied, like sound heard in a room with good acoustics, carrying rather than projecting. It was not accusatory. It was something else. Careful, calibrated, Nadia's heart was going very fast. Her academic brain was producing a list of rational explanations and discarding them in rapid succession. She was also aware that she was not running, that some part of her was not running, and she was not entirely sure why. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. His eyes moved across her face, reading something. "How?" he said. "The document," she said. "In the university library. The pre-migration text in the restricted archive. I've been studying it for 8 months. A pause that had weight in it. That document has been in that archive for 200 years, he said. No one has read it correctly. I'm a linguist, she said. Specifically, I study pre-modern regional dialects of this territory. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly. Something slower. The recalibration of a person adjusting an assumption they had held for a very long time. Behind Nadia, Priya made a small sound that was either going to become a question or a scream. Before it could become either, Nadia turned and said, "Go back to the car." Priya looked at her. "Go back to the car," Nadia said again. "I'm all right." Priya looked at the man standing at the tree line in the dark. Then, back at Nadia. Then she walked very quickly back toward the road, and her footsteps faded, and then there was nothing but the forest, and the dark, and the particular quality of silence that had settled back in around the two of them. Nadia turned back. Kadrin was still there. Still watching her with that attention she was beginning to understand was not threatening. It was interested. Specifically, precisely interested in her in a way that had nothing predatory in it, and something else entirely that she did not yet have a category for. "You should be afraid," he said, not as a threat, as information. "I know," she said. "I'm working on it." She paused. "You should know that I've spent 8 months reading everything written about you, which means I know considerably more about you than you know about me, which might be an advantage." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Almost nothing. Almost the beginning of something. "Tell me your name," he said. "Nadia," she said. He said it back to her. The way he said it made it sound like a word in his language. A word that had meaning beyond the sound of it. He said it like someone trying out a weight. The forest was dark and cold behind him, and the town lights were warm behind her, and she was standing on the exact boundary between both. Which was, she thought, exactly where she had been standing for most of her academic life, without quite realizing it. "Why did you come here tonight?" he said. "A dare," she said honestly. "My friend bet me I wouldn't say it." He looked at her for a long moment. "And would you have come without the dare?" She thought about the 8 months of research, about the specific feeling of reading that document, about the stone and a shoe quality of his name sitting in her mind, waiting. "Yes," she said. Eventually, he nodded. Once, as if this confirmed something. "Walk with me," he said. "I will not harm you. You have my word, and that word has held for 3 centuries and will not break tonight." She looked at the tree line, at the dark beyond it, at him. She walked. The forest changed when he moved through it. This was not metaphor. The quality of light shifted, the darkness redistributing itself around him in a way that left her able to see the ground beneath her feet even without her phone, as if the forest extended to him a courtesy it did not offer ordinary visitors. She noticed this, and chose not to address it immediately. She had a thesis full of noted observations requiring interpretation, and this felt like the same category of thing. Kadrin walked at her pace. This was something she registered specifically because it was deliberate. He could move faster, she had evidence of this, and he was choosing not to. Choosing a speed that matched hers. That kept her comfortable. That did not put him ahead of her, or behind her, but beside her, on the narrow path that seemed to open ahead of them through undergrowth that had no business being that cooperative. "Who sent you to that archive?" he said. "No one," she said. "I requested access independently. My thesis is on liminal space documentation and pre-migration regional texts. The Caldermore document is the oldest surviving example from this territory. What drew you to it specifically?" She thought about how to answer this honestly. "The language," she said. Most documents from that period and region use a standardized written form that was imposed by administrative authorities. The Caldermore document uses something older, a vernacular that predates the administrative language by at least 3 centuries, based on phonological markers. Someone wrote it in the language they actually thought in, rather than the language they were supposed to use. She paused. "I find that interesting. The things people write in their actual language, rather than their official one." He was quiet for a moment. The path curved, and she followed it without understanding how she knew to. "That document was written by a man named Torev," he said, "a scholar who lived at the edge of the forest territories. He came to me with questions. I answered some of them. He wrote what he understood, and some of what he didn't." "You knew him," she said. She felt him look at her without turning her head to confirm it. "Yes," he said. She did the calculation. The document dated to approximately 700 years ago. She added this to the list she was building of things that required a fundamental reorganization of her understanding of what was possible. "What did you answer?" she asked. He was quiet for a few steps. "Questions about what the forest is," he said finally. "What I am. How the territory functions." He paused. He was a careful scholar. He wrote down what he could verify and marked clearly what was interpretation. The name in that document is written in a notation he developed himself because there was no existing script that could capture it correctly. "Which is why no one else has pronounced it accurately," she said. "For 700 years. Yes, his voice carried something. She was learning to identify the undercurrents, what was behind the evenness. This one was the specific weight of a long wait ending. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They were in a clearing she had not seen approaching, circular, with a break in the canopy above, through which stars were visible in the particular density of unlight-polluted sky. The clearing had the quality of a place that was used for something specific, not recently, but regularly, over a very long time. "Why did you come when I said it?" she asked. She turned to face him. She wanted to see his face when he answered. He was looking at the stars, not avoiding her question. Considering it. His profile in the dark was the profile of old paintings, the kind of face that appeared in art from periods where the subject had sat for a long time, and the painter had had enough time to find what was underneath the expression. "My true name is not a sound," he said finally. He turned to look at her. "It is a frequency, a specific resonance. For 300 years, no one has produced it correctly. When you did, I heard it the way you hear your name in a crowded room. Involuntary, immediate." He paused. "I came because I have been waiting to hear it said correctly for longer than I can calculate without it feeling like a reproach." She absorbed this. "Can I ask you something academic?" she said. His mouth moved, that same almost thing at the corner of it. "Yes, the document includes a passage that Toref marked as interpretation," she said. "He writes that the sovereign of the forest territories can only be truly invoked by someone who understands what they are invoking, not just the sound, the meaning behind it." She paused. "My linguistics background tells me that's a poetic way of saying pronunciation requires understanding the phonological system of the source language. But the way he writes it suggests he meant something else." Kadrin looked at her for a long moment. "What do you think he meant?" he said. She thought about the 8 months. About the specific feeling of that document. About reading his name on the page and understanding it differently than as a collection of phonemes, understanding it as a thing that meant something, a specific thing, before she could even identify what the meaning was. "I think he meant that the name carries information about what you are," she said slowly. "And to say it correctly, you have to understand what you're saying, not just how to say it, what it means." A silence. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is what he meant." She looked at him. "So I understood something about what you are before tonight. You have been understanding it for 8 months," he said. In the document, she thought about the reading, about the specific quality of the text, the way it had felt different from other documents, the way she had kept returning to it. "What am I understanding?" she asked. He looked at the stars again, then at her. "In your language there is no single word for it," he said. "In the old dialect there is." He said a word she had not encountered in the document. She repeated it back to him. The vowels were wrong. He corrected her without making it a correction, just producing the sound again. She tried again. "Closer. What does it mean?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Something that is not bound by ordinary time," he said finally. "Something that exists in multiple moments simultaneously, that remembers everything and cannot stop remembering." He paused. "Also, in older usage. Something that is waiting for a specific thing without knowing what the specific thing is until it arrives." She stood in the clearing in the star-visible dark and held that. "You were waiting for someone to say your name correctly," she said. "I was waiting," he said carefully, "for someone who could." She understood the distinction. She was a person who worked with language, and she understood exactly the difference between what he had said and what he had not said, and she understood that both were true simultaneously. "What happens now?" she asked. He looked at her with that attention that she was beginning to understand was not dangerous. It was the most completely focused thing she had ever experienced. The feeling of someone present to you in a way that did not want anything from you, that was simply entirely there. "That," he said, "is your decision." She looked at the forest around them. At the clearing, at the stars through the gap in the canopy, at the man who had been waiting for 700 years for a sound and had gotten it from a graduate student on a dare at 11:30 on a Friday. "Tell me about the territory," she said. "I've been reading about it for 8 months. I want to hear it from you." Something settled in his expression. The particular settling of someone who has been braced for a long time and is cautiously adjusting to the possibility that the bracing might not be necessary. He sat down on the roots of an old tree at the edge of the clearing. She sat a careful distance away, close enough for conversation, far enough to demonstrate that she was choosing proximity rather than defaulting to it. He began to speak. He spoke for 2 hours. She listened with the quality of attention she brought to primary source material, the kind of listening that did not interrupt and did not perform response, that simply received and retained and held the shape of what was being given. He spoke about the territory the way someone spoke about a home they had built over so long a time that they had stopped noticing most of it. The forest had boundaries that did not appear on maps, and they were not arbitrary. They followed geological lines, water table shifts. The specific acoustic properties of the soil that he described in terms she had never heard applied to landscape, but which made sense when he explained them. The territory had logic. It had a system. He had governed it for 300 years, and before him, others of his kind had governed it for longer than written record. His kind. She let this sit without requiring it to be more defined than it was yet. She had enough data to construct a working theory, and she would refine it as she gathered more, which was how she handled everything. By the time he finished, the stars had moved, and the clearing was colder, and she had filled approximately 6 pages in the small notebook she carried everywhere, which she had produced early in his account, and which he had observed without comment. "You're writing this down," he said. "Force of habit," she said. "I can stop." No. He looked at the notebook with an expression she was beginning to be able to read. Something quiet in it. Something that carried the specific weight of being documented by someone who was actually listening. Torev wrote things down too. "Do you miss him?" she said. Then, immediately, felt the strangeness of the question given the arithmetic. He looked at her. It was not an unexpected question in his expression. "Yes," he said. 3 centuries is long enough that grief becomes something else. Not less, exactly, more integrated. He is part of how I understand this forest, because he wrote about it, and I read what he wrote, and sometimes his understanding of it has become my understanding. She wrote, grief integration, temporal scale, how extended beings metabolize loss. Then, she looked up. "Can I ask you something personal?" He said, "You have been asking personal questions for 2 hours. Fair," she said. She looked at her notebook. "Do you get lonely?" The forest settled around them. A wind moved through the canopy above, and she heard the specific sound of very old trees accommodating weather. A sound different from young growth, more measured. "Yes," he said simply. He did not qualify it, did not make it smaller or larger than it was. Just handed it to her. She wrote it down, not because she needed to remember it, but because writing was how she honored things that deserved to be held carefully. "What do you do with it?" she asked. "Work. Mostly." He turned a fallen leaf over in his hands, an unconscious gesture, grounding through touch. The territory requires constant attention. There are 37 distinct ecosystems within these boundaries, and the balance between them is my responsibility. He paused. I also read. Extensively, she looked up from her notebook. "What are you reading currently?" He named a text she recognized. A recent academic monograph on pre-migration linguistic territories in Central Europe. She had read it. She had had problems with the methodology. "The sourcing in Chapter 4 is weak," she said. He draws conclusions from 2 documents and calls it a pattern. Yes, his expression changed. That same quality of adjustment. 2 documents is suggestive at most. He paused. "You've read it." "I reviewed it for a journal," she said. 6 months ago. My review was not favorable. What were your specific objections?" She told him. He listened with the quality of someone who knew more about the subject than the author, and was interested in what she had found without his advantages. They went back and forth on it in the clearing in the dark, and she had the disorienting experience of having the most technically matched academic conversation of her life with a 300-year-old vampire in a forest at 1 in the morning. At some point she realized she was cold. He stood before she said anything about it. "Come," he said. "There is a structure at the eastern edge of the clearing. I use it when I need to work in the forest for extended periods." She followed him across the clearing and through a short distance of trees to a low stone building. Not large, not imposing. The kind of structure built for function over demonstration, with a door that opened to his hand, and the smell of old wood, and something like pine resin, and a fireplace that was cold but had been recently used. He produced fire, with an ease that she filed, in the category of things requiring later analysis. The room was small. A table with books. A single lamp. 2 chairs. A shelf with more books in various states of being read simultaneously, multiple bookmarks visible. She stood in the doorway looking at the books. "You have an active reading list of 11 texts," she said. "I can count the bookmarks." 12, he said. "One is on the table." She looked at the table. A history of navigation, open face down to preserve the page. She picked it up and read the page. He was 50 pages from the end. She sat down. The fire grew. The cold receded. Outside, the forest made its quiet adjustments to the late hour, the sounds of nocturnal things going about their business without reference to human schedules. "My supervisor is going to lose her mind when I tell her about this," Nadia said. "Are you going to tell her?" he asked. "Eventually," she said, "when I have enough material to write it properly." She paused. "You are the primary source for the largest gap in pre-migration territorial linguistics in this region. Every document we have is second or third hand. You were there." He looked at the fire. "Yes," he said. "Would you be willing to talk to me? Not just tonight, more formally. On the record." She paused. "I understand if not. I understand that there are reasons to remain undisclosed. But if you were willing, the academic implications would be significant," he said. "The word that does not translate," she said. "The one you said in the clearing." He looked at her. She said it back to him. Better than her first attempt. Not correct yet, but closer. His expression did something complex. "Almost," he said. "The second vowel is shorter." She said it again. "Yes," he said quietly. "Like that." She wrote the phonetic notation in her notebook. When she looked up, he was watching her with that full, specific attention. "Tell me what it means again," she said. The full meaning. He was quiet for a moment. "Something that exists in multiple moments," he said, "that remembers everything, that has been waiting without knowing what it was waiting for." He paused. "In older usage, it also means the specific feeling of recognition when the waiting ends." She looked at her notation, at the word on the page. "I'd like to come back tomorrow," she said, "with better recording equipment and a formal interview framework, if you're willing." He looked at the fire, then at her. "Yes," he said, "I'm willing." She closed her notebook. The fire was warm. Outside, the forest was doing what forests did at 2 in the morning when the humans had mostly gone to sleep. "How do I find this place without you?" she asked. "You say my name at the tree line," he said. "I'll hear it." She nodded. "Practical then," she said. "I'm sorry I came here on a dare. You deserved better than that for a first meeting." He looked at her for a long moment. The corner of his mouth moved. The same almost thing she was beginning to understand was the outermost edge of his smile. "You still said it correctly," he said. "The reason doesn't change the result." She gathered her notebook and her coat. He walked her back through the forest to the tree line, the path opening before them again, in that cooperative way, the darkness redistributing itself courteously. When she reached the road, she turned back. He was at the tree line, not following, just present. "Kadrin," she said. Correctly, he inclined his head. "Nadia," he said. She walked back to the road where Priya's car was still waiting with Priya inside it, and she got in, and Priya looked at her with the expression of someone who had been sitting alone in a dark car for 2 hours, reassessing the concept of dares. "Well," Priya said. "I have a lot to process," Nadia said. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I think I'm more all right than I've been in a while, actually." She looked out the window at the tree line. The dark was just dark from here. But she knew what was in it. Her supervisor, Professor Aldrich, was a woman who had spent 30 years making folklore academically defensible and had developed a comprehensive immunity to being surprised. She received Nadia's preliminary account on Monday morning with the expression of someone processing information through multiple filters simultaneously. "Let me understand," she said. "You made direct contact with a primary source entity for the Caldermore documentation, and he has agreed to formal interviews." "Yes," Nadia said. "A living primary source." Living being a relative term, who has direct memory of the period the document describes. "Yes." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. She picked up her coffee, put it down without drinking it, picked it up again. "The academic implications of this," she said carefully, "are considerable." "I know. Your thesis framework will need to be restructured entirely." "I know." Aldrich looked at her for a long moment, with the assessment of someone reading a student she had known for 4 years and identifying something new in them. "You went back yesterday." "Yes," Nadia said. 4 hours of recorded interview. I have 11 pages of notes and approximately 2.5 hours of usable audio covering the administrative history of the territory from the pre-migration period through the establishment of the current boundary framework. Aldrich set down her coffee. "That is," she said precisely, "the most significant primary source acquisition in this department's history." She paused. "How are you?" "I'm fine," Nadia said. She meant it. She had gone home Saturday night and slept 6 hours and woken up clear, which was different from the complicated morning quality she had been carrying through her 4th year, the low-grade anxiousness of a thesis that wasn't quite resolving. She felt resolved. Not in the sense of finished, but in the sense of finally pointed at something real. The Sunday interview had been at the stone structure in the forest. She had come to the tree line at 9 in the morning, said his name, and he had appeared in less than a minute, which she had timed and recorded as a data point. He had led her back through the forest. She had set up her recording equipment and her formal interview framework, and they had worked for 4 hours with the structured efficiency of 2 people who both took documentation seriously. He was an extraordinary interview subject. He answered exactly what was asked, with the precision of someone who had spent centuries learning the difference between what he knew and what he inferred. He flagged uncertainty. He provided sourcing where he had it. He corrected her working assumptions without making her feel corrected. He also made tea at some point without making a production of it, and the tea was, for the second time, exactly right. She had asked about this on the way out. "How do you know how I take it?" He had paused. "I pay attention," he said. She had written this in her notebook under the heading Observational Capacity, and then looked at the entry and acknowledged to herself that it was not entirely an academic notation. The 3rd interview was Wednesday. The 4th was Friday. By the following week, they had established what was effectively a research schedule, 3 sessions per week, 2 to 3 hours each, working chronologically through the territorial history. She prepared questions in advance. He reviewed them and occasionally sent back a single sentence the night before via a method she had not yet fully investigated, a folded piece of paper that appeared on her desk in the morning with the specific quality of having been placed rather than slid under the door, though her door had been locked. His notes were in an old hand but legible. Corrections, additions, things he wanted to address that her questions didn't capture. She began incorporating these into her preparation. 3 weeks into the research schedule, Priya cornered her in the library. "You're different," Priya said, without preamble. "I'm working well," Nadia said. "That's not what I mean," Priya said. She sat down across from her and looked at her with the attention of someone who had been watching her closely for 4 years. "You went from finishing your thesis, but not really to actually finishing it. But that's not the whole thing either." Nadia looked at her laptop. "I made significant contact with a primary source," she said. "It's changed the research." Priya looked at her for a long moment. She started. "Don't," Nadia said. I'm just saying I was there for 3 seconds, and I noticed certain things about he's a research subject, Nadia said. Priya looked at her with the expression of someone who had known her long enough to have a detailed picture of when she was being accurate and when she was being careful. Sure, Priya said. Nadia closed her laptop. He is a 300-year-old vampire sovereign who governs a forest territory and has direct memory of events 7 centuries prior, she said precisely. He is an irreplaceable primary source for my research. That is what this is. Priya opened her mouth, and I'm aware, Nadia said, before Priya could speak, that I voluntarily extended the research schedule 3 times, and that I now prepare for the interviews with a thoroughness that exceeds academic necessity, and that I walk to the tree line on non-interview days sometimes, for reasons I haven't fully articulated. I'm aware of all of this. Priya closed her mouth. I'm dealing with it academically, Nadia said, by which I mean I'm documenting it carefully and not acting on anything prematurely, and being very precise about the distinction between what is research and what is something else. That is the most Nadia way possible of having feelings, Priya said. I'm aware of that too, Nadia said. She went back to her laptop. Priya sat with her for a while in the comfortable silence of a long friendship, and then eventually left, and Nadia stared at her screen and thought about the Sunday before last, when the 4th interview had run over its scheduled time by 90 minutes because they had moved from the formal framework into a conversation about memory and documentation and the specific ethical question of what a person owed the historical record versus what they were entitled to. Keep private. He had said, there are things in 3 centuries that I have not told anyone, not because they are shameful, but because they were mine. He had paused. I am finding that I want to tell some of them to you. She had looked up from her notebook. Not for the research, he said. Carefully, for the other reason. She had not asked what the other reason was. She had understood what he meant, and they had both sat with the understanding for a moment, and then continued the interview, and neither of them had referenced it again. But she had thought about it every day since. She opened a new document on her laptop, titled it Interview Preparation Session 11. Started typing questions. Looked at the questions. They were good questions, precise and well structured. She added one at the end that was not in the formal framework. What do you want? Outside the territory? Outside the work? She looked at it. Then she saved the document and closed the laptop and went to prepare for the next morning. Session 11 ran differently from the start. She arrived at the tree line at the usual time, said his name, and he appeared with the usual efficiency. But as they walked through the forest, she noticed a change in the quality of his quiet, the way it had a different texture from the preceding weeks. She catalogued this without addressing it directly. She was learning his registers. The stone structure was the same. Fire, books, 2 chairs. She set up her recorder. He waited. She ran through 9 of her prepared questions. The material was extraordinary, as it always was. He was describing the administrative changes following a territorial conflict 4 centuries prior, a period she had 3 fragmentary documents covering, and his account filled gaps that had been structurally unfillable by any other means. Then, she reached the final question. She looked at her notes, looked at him. What do you want, she said. Outside the territory, outside the work. He was quiet for a long moment. The recorder light blinked steadily. She had learned not to fill his silences, that they were thinking rather than avoidance, and she waited. This is not in your usual framework, he said. No, she said. He looked at the fire. Outside this conversation, he said, I want what I have wanted for a long time and not known how to have. He paused. Company that is not obligation. someone to speak to who is present, not afraid of me, not wanting something from me. He paused again, just present. She looked at her notebook. She was not writing. You have that here, she said carefully. In the research, something moved in his expression. Yes, he said. I know. She understood that he was being precise, that he was telling her something specific, and that the precision was a form of respect, of giving her accurate information rather than manageable information. She said, I need to tell you something. He looked at her. I came here initially because I had spent 8 months with a document, and I needed to understand it better, she said. That's true. She paused. I have also been coming back because I want to, not just for the research. She looked at her notebook. I'm not confused about the difference. I've been careful about distinguishing them, but I think I've been using the research framework to defer something that I should probably address directly. He was very still. I don't know what this is, she said, referring to the space between them. I don't have a framework for it. That is a genuinely unusual experience for me, because I have a framework for most things. She paused, but I know that when I walk to the tree line on non-interview days, I'm not going because of the thesis. The fire made its sound. The forest outside was doing what it did. He said her name. Just her name. The way he had said it the first night, as if it were a word in his language that meant something. She looked up. I have been alive for 300 years, he said. He said it not as a barrier, but as information, the way she appreciated. I have had, he paused, selecting the word carefully, connections before. I understand what they are and what they cost. He looked at her directly. I am not confused about what I feel. I have been precise about it for several weeks. She absorbed this. The specific weight of someone who did not say things they did not mean, telling her exactly what he meant. There is a practical reality, she said, which is that you are permanent, and I am not. Yes, he said. I know this more concretely than you do. He paused. I am not offering you a solution to it. I am not going to pretend the asymmetry doesn't exist. What I can tell you is that I have thought about it carefully, and my conclusion is that the time there is worth more than the protection of not engaging with it. She thought about the work, about 11 sessions of extraordinary research, about the conversations outside the framework, the ones about the monograph methodology and the reading list and the specific sound of old trees in wind, about the tea that was always exactly right, about walking to the tree line on days she had no scheduled reason to be there. I'm going to keep coming here, she said, whether we address this or not. The research needs months more, and I would be here regardless. I know, he said. So we're already in it, she said. He looked at her with that full specific attention. We have been in it, he said, since you said my name. She closed her notebook. The recorder was still running and she would deal with that later, would probably delete this portion or keep it. She hadn't decided, but either way it was her data and her decision. She said, I don't want to be careful about the wrong things. He waited. I've been very careful my whole life, she said, about being rigorous, about not drawing conclusions from insufficient data, about not letting feeling compromise the work. She paused. I think I've applied those habits to things they were never meant to apply to. He stood from his chair, crossed the small distance between them, and crouched in front of her chair so they were at eye level. Not crowding, offering. His hand came up slowly, and she understood that it was offered rather than taken, waiting for her to decide. She looked at it. Then, she covered it with hers. His hands were cool. She had known this from the first night. She held his hand in both of hers and felt the temperature and the steadiness and the specific quality of something that had been patient for a very long time, carefully receiving what it had been patient for. "I'm going to be difficult sometimes," she said. "Academically, I'll push back on things I think you're wrong about. I'm counting on it," he said. "And I'm keeping the research separate. Whatever this is doesn't change the methodology." "Of course," he said. The corner of his mouth, that almost thing that she understood now, was full warmth expressed at a scale calibrated to 3 centuries of learning to be careful with it. She looked at their hands, at the firelight, at the books on the shelf, 12 texts simultaneously in progress, the navigation history open on the table. "Read me something," she said, "from the old dialect. Something I haven't studied yet." He stood, went to the shelf, selected a volume she had not seen before, returned to his chair and opened it, and began to read in a language that was the oldest she had ever heard spoken, that carried in it the specific frequency of something that existed in multiple moments simultaneously, that remembered everything. She closed her eyes and listened, and the forest held its quiet around them, and outside the territory went on being what it was, and inside the stone structure in the clearing, something that had been suspended for a very long time began, carefully and honestly, to move. 3 months into what neither of them had named, Nadia defended her preliminary thesis findings before the department faculty. She presented 6 weeks of recorded interviews with a verified pre-migration primary source, supported by linguistic analysis, demonstrating a direct line of continuity between the Caldermore document and the oral historical record she had documented. She did not name her source. She described him as a surviving practitioner of the pre-migration territorial tradition, which was accurate and sufficient for the academic framework. The faculty would receive more information in stages as she understood what she was ethically permitted to disclose. Professor Aldrich asked the questions she had anticipated. 2 other faculty members asked questions she had not. She answered everything. The preliminary findings were accepted. She walked out of the presentation room and felt the particular relief of a structure holding under examination. Cadron's note was on her desk when she returned to her office. A single line in his old hand. How did it hold? She wrote back on the same paper. "Well, they want more." She left it on her desk. When she arrived the following morning, the paper had a second line beneath hers. "Good. So do I." She put the paper in her notebook. The research had expanded in ways she had not anticipated. He had begun bringing her materials she had not requested, documents from his own archive that had never been held by any academic institution, objects from the territory's administrative history that she catalogued with gloves and a digital camera and a running commentary of professional amazement. He watched her work through these materials with the expression she now recognized as his particular form of satisfaction. Not pride exactly, but the specific pleasure of someone watching knowledge receive the care it deserved. She had met, in the preceding weeks, several of the territory's permanent residents. Not vampires she was building up to the full scope of what the territory contained, but humans who had come to live within its boundaries by various routes over various centuries. There was a woman named Sophie, who was perhaps 70, and had been a botanist before she found the forest, and now maintained the record of its ecosystem changes across 60 years of observation. There was a man, Remy, who had arrived 40 years ago, escaping something he had never specified, and had stayed because the territory had needed a carpenter, and he had turned out to be the kind of person who needed to be needed by something permanent. They received her without surprise. She understood that Cadron had prepared the way somehow, that her arrival had been contextualized for them, that they were treating her as someone who belonged here, rather than someone to be assessed. This was, she noted in her research journal, consistent with his pattern of removing unnecessary friction from things he wanted to sustain. She also noted, in the personal portion of the journal that she had started keeping separately from the academic record, "I feel at home here. I am aware this is significant." The unnamed thing between them had texture now. Morning walks through the territory before research sessions, When he showed her the systems he was describing in the interviews, the specific places where 3 centuries of observation had given him knowledge no document could contain. Evenings, sometimes after the formal work was finished, in the stone structure, or occasionally in a larger building deeper in the forest that turned out to be his primary residence, a place she reached only after 2 months of incremental trust, that contained more books than the stone structure and fires in every room, and the accumulated evidence of a life built for depth rather than display. He had shown her his library. This was the moment she understood something irreversible had occurred in whatever was happening between them, because the library was the interior of his mind, made physical. 300 years of reading and annotating and cross-referencing, books in 14 languages, margins filled with his precise handwriting, whole conversations between texts carried on in the white spaces at the edges of pages. She had stood in the library for a long time without speaking. He had stood at the door and watched her absorb it. "I've never shown this to anyone," he said. There was no self-consciousness in it, just information. "Why now?" she asked. She looked up when he didn't answer immediately. He was watching her the way he watched things he was trying to hold correctly in his understanding. "Because you would understand it," he said. She turned back to the shelves. "Because I would understand it as a library, or because I would understand it," as she gestured at the room, meaning everything it was. "Both," he said. She spent 2 hours in the library that day. He sat in a chair at the far end and read, and she moved through the shelves and occasionally brought him a book with a question, and he answered. And this was, she thought, the most naturally she had ever existed in a space with another person. On the walk back through the forest, she said, "I need to tell you something about my life before this." He walked beside her, at her pace. "I was engaged," she said, 2 years ago, to someone I had known for a long time and thought I understood, and turned out to understand less than I thought. She paused. When it ended, it was because I realized I had been performing a version of myself in that relationship rather than being myself. The version that was manageable, that fit the available space. He was quiet, listening. "I've been very careful since then," she said, "about not doing that again, about not making myself smaller to fit someone else's available space." She paused. "I want you to know that I'm aware I am not doing that here. That this," she indicated the territory, the forest, the conversation, all of it does not require me to be less. "I know," he said. "Then, carefully, I watched you from the first evening, and what I saw was someone in full. Not managing herself. Not performing." He paused. That is what I found he used the old dialect word, the one she had learned, the one that meant recognition when waiting ends. She said the word back correctly. She had been practicing. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." They walked in the cooperative dark of the forest at his pace now, slower than hers, and she matched it without thinking about it. And they came out of the trees at the road and stood for a moment at the boundary. He did not cross it. She understood this as a choice rather than a limitation. The territory was his. The road led to her world. He stood at the edge of his and watched her. She turned at the road. "Kadrin," she said. He inclined his head. "I'll be here Thursday," she said. "I'll hear you coming," he said. She walked to her car. She drove back to the town that had been pretending the forest wasn't there since before the town existed. She went to her desk and opened her research journal and wrote 3 pages of notes, and then opened the personal journal and wrote 1 sentence. "I think I am exactly where I am supposed to be." The man from the university's ethics board arrived on a Thursday. He was pleasant and methodical, and carrying a document that outlined the institution's position on research involving non-human subjects with legal personhood ambiguity, which was a category that had been added to the ethics framework 2 years prior, following several high-profile cases at other institutions. He sat across from Nadia in her office and explained that her preliminary findings, circulated internally after the faculty presentation, had triggered a review. She read the document. Then, she read it again. The concern was substantive. Research involving a being of Kadron's nature occupied a complicated space in academic ethics. Was he a research subject requiring formal consent protocols? Was he a collaborator, in which case co-authorship questions arose? Was he a primary source in the archival sense, which raised different questions about access and disclosure? The board wanted answers before the research proceeded. She spent 2 hours with the ethics board representative answering questions, and took the documentation home, and spent the evening reading it with the attention she brought to things that mattered. The following morning she went to the forest. She said his name at the tree line. He appeared. She told him everything, all of it. The document, the board's concerns, the specific questions about his status in relation to her research. She gave him the actual language because he deserved the actual language. He read the document she had brought, standing at the tree line in the morning cold, and was quiet for a long time after. "What do you want to do?" she said. "Because this is your decision more than mine." He looked at the document, then at her. "I want to meet with them," he said. She blinked. "If there are questions about my status in relation to this research," he said, "I will answer them directly. I have governed this territory without formal documentation for 3 centuries, and I am not afraid of an ethics board." She looked at him for a moment. "You understand that this would mean," she paused, "a degree of disclosure. More people would know what you are." "Yes," he folded the document and handed it back. "You have been careful with what you know. You have been precise about what you disclose, and to whom." He paused. "I trust your judgment about how this proceeds." The word trust from him landed with its full weight. She had been learning what he gave and did not give, and trust was not given casually. She said, "I'll arrange it." The meeting with the ethics board representative happened the following week, at the stone structure in the forest. Because Kadron had offered 2 locations, and Nadia had correctly anticipated that bringing a university official into the forest would produce better results than attempting to bring Kadron into a conference room. He was, as a meeting participant, extraordinary. He answered every question exactly. He provided documentation from his own archive that addressed the consent and collaboration questions more thoroughly than the board had anticipated. He had clearly given the ethics framework serious thought and had prepared for the meeting with the rigor of someone who had been building cases for centuries. Afterward, the board representative sat in the other chair for a long moment and said, "I came here expecting this to be complicated." "It is complicated," Kadron said, "but not for the reasons you anticipated." The representative left. Nadia and Kadron sat in the stone structure after, and she looked at the fire and said, "You prepared for that meeting." "For 4 days," he confirmed. "You didn't tell me." "I didn't want you to worry about it," he said. She looked at him. "That's not how we work," she said. "I don't want things managed for me. I want to know what's happening." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're right. I apologize." He said it without qualification or defense. Old habit. Managing situations so that people are not burdened. She held his pause. The people followed by the correction. She understood what he had almost said. "I can handle burden," she said. "I would rather carry things honestly with you than have them managed for me." "Yes," he said. "I understand." That was the first thing between them that needed repairing, and they repaired it cleanly, and it mattered because of how it was handled. The ethics board approved the research 3 weeks later under a framework that classified Kadron as a collaborative primary source with full co-authorship rights over any material derived from his direct testimony. She told him when the approval came through. He looked at the letter for a long time. "I have been in this territory for 300 years, he said. and I have never had a document that acknowledged my existence in formal terms. He paused. This is strange. Good strange or bad strange, she asked. Both, he said. He folded the letter. Kept it. She watched him and thought about what it meant to exist for 3 centuries without official acknowledgement. To govern a territory, and tend a forest, and maintain a library, and remember everything, and have none of it legible to the world outside the trees. I'm going to fix that, she said. He looked at her. The research, she said. When it's published. People will know this territory exists. They'll know its history. They'll know she paused. Not everything. You'll decide what goes in and what doesn't. But enough. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something in the old dialect that she was now fluent enough to follow, not translate exactly. Follow. It was the word for the feeling of being documented by someone who was actually listening, the same word he had used months ago when she had first taken out her notebook. She wrote it in her journal. Both journals. 6 months after the dare, Nadia's younger sister came to Velnath for the weekend. Zara was 28, working in urban planning, and had the quality of someone who asked direct questions without apology and expected direct answers. She arrived Friday evening with a bag and 3 questions already prepared, based on the fragments Nadia had shared over the phone over the preceding months. They sat in Nadia's kitchen, and Nadia made tea, and Zara looked at her with the attention of someone who had grown up in the same house and had a detailed internal model of her sister's baseline. You look different, Zara said. I feel different, Nadia said. Tell me about him. Nadia had been deciding how to tell this story for weeks, running different versions in her head, calibrating how much and in what order. She looked at her tea and then looked at her sister and decided to tell it the way it actually was. She told all of it. The dare, the forest, the name, the appearance at the tree line, the 2 hours in the clearing, the research, the ethics board, the library, the unnamed thing that had been accumulating for 6 months in the careful space between a linguist and a 300-year-old vampire sovereign who had been waiting without knowing what he was waiting for. Zara listened without interrupting. This was one of Zara's qualities. She had the patience of someone who understood that incomplete information produced incomplete assessments. When Nadia finished, Zara was quiet for a moment. Are you safe? She asked. Yes, Nadia said. Genuinely yes. I have never felt unsafe. Do you trust him? Nadia thought about this with the precision it deserved. Yes, she said, more than I have trusted most people. He is, she paused. He doesn't want anything from me that I haven't offered. He corrects himself when he gets things wrong. He makes space rather than taking it. Zara looked at her tea. What does he want? Nadia thought about the conversation in the stone structure, months ago now, the specific quality of his answer. Company that is not obligation. Someone present without agenda. He wants what most people want, she said. Just he's had to wait longer for it. Zara considered this. What do you want? Nadia looked at the window, at the direction of the forest. I want to keep going, she said. I don't know where it ends up, but I know that what is already there is more real than most things I have had, and I want to keep building it. Zara looked at her for a long moment with the complex assessment of a sister. Then she said, Will you take me to the tree line? On Saturday morning, Nadia took Zara to the edge of the forest. She said his name at the tree line correctly, with the phonological precision she had been refining for 6 months. He appeared in under a minute. He stood at the tree line and looked at Zara with his full quality of attention, and Zara looked back at him with the assessment of a woman who evaluated structures for a living. He inclined his head. Zara, he said. She had told him about Zara. He had clearly listened. Kadrin, Zara said. She said it slightly wrong. He did not correct her. They walked in the forest for an hour, the three of them, and Kadrin spoke about the territory with the same generosity he brought to the research sessions, answering Zara's questions with precision and without condescension. Zara asked about the administrative history, about the ecosystem management, about what 3 centuries of continuous governance of a single territory did to a person's relationship to time. He answered everything. Nadia walked beside him and listened, and felt the specific pleasure of watching 2 people she trusted be honest with each other. On the walk back to the road, Zara fell slightly behind. Kadrin and Nadia walked ahead, and he said quietly, "Your sister is evaluating me." "She's evaluating whether you're good for me," Nadia said. "Yes," he said. "I know." He paused. "What do you think she's concluding?" Nadia glanced back at Zara, who was looking at the canopy with the expression of someone processing. "Ask her," she said. He looked at her. Then, over his shoulder, he said, "Zara, what's your conclusion?" Zara looked at him. Then at Nadia. Then back at him. She said, "You're going to outlive her." "Yes," he said. "You know that." "Yes, and you're choosing this anyway." "Yes." Zara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay." It was the most compact form of approval Nadia had ever witnessed. She looked at Zara. Zara looked at her. "He's good," Zara said simply. "You're good together." That evening, Zara and Nadia sat in Nadia's kitchen again, and Zara said, "The way he looked at you when you weren't looking at him. What about it?" "I've never seen anyone look at another person like they were a source of light," Zara said. Nadia looked at her tea. "He's been in that forest for a very long time," she said eventually. "I know," Zara said. "That's why it matters more." 7 months after the dare, Nadia said, "I want to spend more time in the territory." They were in his library. She had been here often enough now that she had her own shelf, a small section he had cleared without comment where her notebooks lived, and a rotation of texts she was working through. She looked up from the book in her lap and said it the way she said most things, directly and with the work already done of deciding she meant it. He looked up from his correspondence. "More time," she said. "Not just the research sessions. I want to understand the territory as a place, rather than just as a subject." She paused. "I want to understand your life here." He was quiet for a moment. "This is what you want," he said. "Not what you think would be useful for the research." She looked at him. "Both," she said. "But yes. What I want." He set down his pen. "Come with me," he said. He took her through the territory that evening in a way different from the research walks. No documentation. No prepared questions. Just the forest and his voice explaining things because he wanted her to know them, not because they were data. He showed her where the territory's oldest tree stood, a yew so old that its documentation predated him, that he had known for 2 centuries. He showed her the places where the boundary could be felt rather than seen, the air-changing quality at points where the territory's governance was most deeply established. He showed her the lake. She had seen it from the air on her first day, from the private jet, the mirror still lake at the estate's eastern edge. She had not been to it. It was a 20-minute walk from his residence, and they arrived at dusk, and the water was doing the exact thing it had done from altitude, holding the sky in perfect reversal, so that standing at the edge you had the sensation of being between 2 heavens. He sat down at the edge, and she sat beside him, and they watched the light change across the water for a long time without speaking. "I come here when the territory requires something difficult," he said finally. "When a decision has to be made that I do not want to make, or when a loss has to be absorbed that is going to take time." He paused. "I have sat here for 3 centuries with things I had no one to tell." She looked at the water. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she said. He was quiet for a long time. The light kept changing. "When I was changed," he said finally, "it was not my choice. I have made peace with this. I have had 300 years to make peace with it, and I have done so. But there are moments, fewer now than before, when I feel the specific weight of the original absence of choice, and I have to sit with it until it passes. She did not offer comfort in the form of reframing. She just listened. I did not choose this life, he said. I chose what to do with it. Those are different things. He paused. For a long time I was angry about the distinction. Now I am not grateful exactly. Something more honest than grateful. Something more like I have built something worth having from something I did not ask for. She thought about her engagement, about the 14 months of managed performance, about the window she had not climbed through, and the life she had not escaped, and what it had cost her differently from what it had cost the fictional woman in a wedding dress, but cost her nonetheless. She thought about the 4 years of thesis work that had led to a dare at a tree line, and how she had not planned to be here, in this specific life, sitting at this lake at dusk. I didn't choose to be here either, she said, not in the way of planning it. She paused. I think sometimes the best things are the ones you arrive at rather than select. He looked at her. The dare was Priya's idea, she said. I just said the name. He appeared. And then I didn't leave. He was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you leave? He said. She thought about the first night, about the clearing, about the quality of his attention, the specific feeling of being received by someone who wanted nothing from her. I felt like myself, she said. Immediately, fully, like I had been practicing a slightly wrong version for years, and suddenly the correct version was just available. He looked at the lake. That is why I waited, he said. He said it quietly, the way he said things that were true and large and did not need amplification. I did not know what I was waiting for until you said my name. But when you did, I understood immediately what had been missing. She looked at the water doubling the sky. What was missing, she said. Someone who would say it correctly, he said. Not just the sound, the meaning. Someone who understood what they were invoking. She held the word, understood. Thought about 8 months of a document and the stone in a shoe quality of his name, and the sense of approaching something true before she knew what the true thing was. She covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand and held hers. The light finished changing. The lake held the first stars. They sat at the edge of the territory's oldest water and were quiet together in the way that needed no management, that simply was. Kadrin, she said eventually. He turned to look at her. I'm going to keep coming here, she said. Not because of the thesis. She paused. I don't know what to call what this is yet, but I know it's the most real thing I have. He said her name, the way he always said it, as a word with meaning in it. Then he said, in the old dialect, what we are is described by the word for two things that became legible to each other. She had not encountered this usage. Tell me the word, she said. He said it. She repeated it. He corrected the final syllable gently. She said it again. Yes, he said. Like that. She wrote it in her mind in the notation she had developed for the dialect, precise and phonologically complete. She would write it in her journal later, in both journals, in the column where she kept the words that did not translate into other languages. The stars multiplied. The lake held all of them. Her thesis defense was scheduled for March. She had been preparing for 4 months, building the document from its new foundation, the one that Kadrin's testimony had made possible. 600 pages. 14 languages cited. A primary source bibliography that no other document in the field's history contained. She worked on it in her university office, and in his library, and at the kitchen table in her flat, and occasionally at the stone structure in the forest, when the work needed the specific quality of quiet that place contained. He read every draft. This had not been formally agreed upon. It had simply happened, sections appearing on his desk and coming back with notes in the old precise handwriting, observations and corrections, and occasionally a single word that changed the logic of an entire passage. She had incorporated every one. 2 weeks before the defense, she was working late in his library when she said, "I'm afraid." He looked up. "Not a failing," she said. "The work is solid." She paused. "Of what comes after. If this succeeds, the field changes. People will come here. They'll want access to you, to the territory, to the archive. I spent months working to make you legible to the world, and I'm only now thinking about what that means for you." He set down his book, looked at her with the full quality of his attention. "I have thought about this," he said. "I have been thinking about it since the ethics board meeting." "And," she said. "And I accept it," he said. He said it simply. "I have governed this territory in invisibility for 3 centuries, not because I chose it, but because disclosure was not safe. The world has changed, and you have changed it further by building a framework that gives me legal standing." He paused. "I would rather exist officially, with the complications that brings, than continue existing in a way that means nothing I have built can be formally acknowledged." She looked at the library, at the 40 years of Sophie's ecological records, at Remy's carpentry in every doorframe and shelf bracket, at Kadrin's annotated margins, the running conversation with 3 centuries of thought. "After the defense," she said, "things will move quickly." "Yes," he said. "I want to make sure you're ready." He looked at her with something in his expression she had been seeing more of in recent months, as the unnamed thing between them had grown into something that simply was, that no longer required naming, because it was too present to need a label. The specific warmth behind the stillness, the quality of someone who had learned to be careful with expression over 3 centuries and was choosing not to be. "I have been waiting for something worth being ready for," he said, "for a very long time." He paused. "I am ready." The defense was on a Thursday in March. She stood in front of the committee for 3 hours. They asked every question she had anticipated, and several she had not. She answered with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this specific conversation for 4 years, 8 months of which had included access to sources the committee could not have dreamed of. When it was done, the committee chair said, "This is the most significant contribution to pre-migration territorial linguistics since the field was established." She walked out of the building into the March air and stood on the steps and felt the specific quality of a long effort reaching completion. Not the end of something, the beginning of what the thing had been building toward. She went to the tree line. She said his name. He appeared in less than a minute. He looked at her face. "It held," she said. He said something in the old dialect that she knew now well enough to understand without translation. The word for a thing built carefully over a long time that turned out to be exactly what it was meant to be. She said, "There's something I want to tell you." He waited. "I came here 7 months ago because of a dare, and because of 8 months of a document, and because I had nowhere better to be," she said. She looked at him directly. "And I have built a life here, not in the forest exactly. Here, in this work, in this territory, in this." She indicated the space between them. "I need you to know that this is chosen. Entirely chosen. Not arrived at by accident. I could have left at any point and I didn't, and I am telling you now that I have thought about it clearly and I want to stay." He looked at her for a long moment, with that full attention, the quality of it familiar now in the way of things that had become essential. Then he said, "I have been alone in this territory for 300 years. I have been careful and patient, and I have built things worth building, and they have been mine alone." He paused. "I want them to be ours." She stepped across the boundary at the tree line into the forest. She had done this hundreds of times. This time felt different. She stopped in front of him. He raised a hand and touched her face the way he had learned to, carefully, with the full consciousness of someone who did not take contact for granted. His thumb traced along her jaw, In the old dialect, she said, "What is the word for choosing someone when you could have left?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said a word she had not heard before, a sound like the first warmth after a long cold, and something recognizing itself. She repeated it. She got it right the first time. "Yes," he said quietly. "Exactly that." She stood at the boundary of the forest in the March cold with the warmth of the territory at her back, and looked at the face of a man who had been waiting for 300 years for someone to say his name correctly, and thought, this is what it feels like to choose and be chosen simultaneously. To arrive somewhere at the exact right time, not because you planned it, but because you did not stop moving toward it. "I'm staying," she said. He said her name. Then he took her hand, and they walked into the forest together, and the trees opened ahead of them, and the territory settled around them, and 300 years of careful waiting became something else, something that did not have an old dialect word for it yet, because it had not existed in the language before. Outside the forest, the world went on making its decisions, and building its structures, and telling its stories. Inside the territory, the oldest ewe continued its long, slow counting of centuries, and Sophie documented the spring growth, and Remy repaired a door in the east wing, and the lake held the sky in perfect reversal, and everything that had been built continued to be built. And at the tree line where everything had started, where a name had been said correctly for the first time in 700 years, two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of the cost and the gift of it continued the conversation that had begun on a dare and become, over 7 months of care and rigor and honest accumulation, the most real thing either of them had. Spring arrived in the territory the way Kadrin had described it once in the third research session, as a conversation between the soil and the canopy, each responding to the other in a sequence so established it had its own rhythm, its own logic, its own annual argument toward green. Nadia was there for it. She had moved into his residence 6 weeks after the thesis defense, not as a decision made in a single moment, but as the natural conclusion of a process that had been happening for months, her belongings migrating incrementally into the spaces he made for them, her routines grafting themselves onto his with the ease of things that were compatible at the structural level. A shelf in the library that became 2 shelves, a second set of keys, which he had made without commenting on it, that she found on her desk in the stone structure one morning, her notebook on the table beside his navigation history, which he had finally finished and replaced with a text on acoustic geography. Priya came in April. She stood in the library for a long time and ran her hand along the spines and looked at the 2 shelves that were clearly Nadia's and the way the room held evidence of 2 people's simultaneous presence, and said, in the tone of someone confirming what they had already suspected, "You're happy?" "Yes," Nadia said. Like actually happy. Not finishing the thesis happy, or got the answer happy. "Yes," Nadia said. Like actually. Priya picked up the slim volume of untranslatable poetry, the one from the first night in the clearing, turned it over, put it back exactly where it was, which told Nadia something about Priya that she had always known. "He makes space for you," Priya said. "Yes, and you make space for him." "Yes," Priya looked around the library, the books in 14 languages, the margins dense with 3 centuries of annotation, the evidence of a life built for depth. "Good," Priya said simply. They had dinner that night, the 3 of them, and Kadrin was, with Priya, exactly what he was with everyone, fully present, precisely honest, interested in the person in front of him rather than in managing their impression of him. He asked Priya about her urban planning work with genuine curiosity. She asked him about the territory's development over 3 centuries with equal genuineness. They debated a question about the relationship between planned and organic growth in human settlements that ran through dinner and into the evening, with the productive energy of 2 people, discovering they disagreed in interesting ways. Afterward, when Priya had gone to the guest room, Kadrin said, "Your friend is extraordinary. She's been my closest friend since we were 8. Nadia said. She tells me the truth even when I am not asking for it. Yes, he said. I could tell. She looked at him. What did you tell? That she has been watching over you for a long time, he said, and that she is deciding whether to keep doing that or whether you are now in capable hands. He paused. The corner of his mouth. I think she concluded capable. Nadia looked at the fire, then at him. She said, in the old dialect, the word for two people who had become legible to each other. The full word, with the correct vowel length, the correct consonant weight. He looked at her, said something back. A word she had learned the month before. The one meaning, and this is what I have been. She crossed the room and sat beside him. He put his arm around her, and she settled against his side, and they were quiet in the library with the fire and the books and the spring moving through the territory outside, and she thought about the word he had said, and held it the way she held words that deserved care. I have something to tell you, she said. He waited. My publisher wants the thesis as a book, she said. Not an academic text, a trade publication. They want the story, not just the findings. She paused. Which means writing about how the research happened, who the source is, what the territory is. She turned to look at him. It would be public in a way the academic publication is not. I need to know if you're willing. He was quiet for a long time. She had learned not to fill his silences. Tell me what the book would say, he said. She told him. The complete scope of it. How she had come to the forest, what she had found, the research, the ethics framework, the territory's history. And yes, she said. The rest. She looked at her hands. What happened between us, not as the point of the book, but as part of the truth of how it was built. He absorbed this. What do you want to do? He said. She looked up. I want to write it honestly, she said. I have spent my academic life writing things that were true and carefully constructed, and I want to write something that is also real. She paused, but not at your expense. If you don't want this, I won't do it. He was quiet for a long time, longer than usual. Then he said, I spent 300 years without documentation, without official existence, without the world outside this territory knowing anything about what had been built here. He paused, and now there is a possibility that what I have built, what we have built, could be legible, could be part of the record. He paused again. Yes, write it honestly. She looked at him. All of it, he said. The dare, the name, the 2 hours in the clearing. He paused. The library. She looked at the 2 shelves that were hers. Yes, she said. She began writing the following week. She worked in the library and in her university office, and at the stone structure, and at the lake on days when the thinking needed air. He left her alone when she needed to be alone, and was present when she needed presence, and read what she wrote, and offered notes in the old precise handwriting that had become as familiar to her as her own. The book took 8 months. It was the most difficult thing she had written, because true things required a different rigor than documented things, a different accountability. She wrote about fear and precision, and the specific quality of arriving somewhere you had not planned to be. She wrote about a name that was also a frequency. She wrote about a library in a forest, and a language no living person had spoken for 700 years, and what it felt like to learn it. She wrote about choosing and being chosen, and the words in an old dialect that carried the weight of both. He read the final manuscript in a single night. In the morning he found her at breakfast, and sat across from her and said, You wrote me honestly. Yes, she said. Not the version of me that would be most sympathetic or most legible to people who don't know me. He paused. The actual version. I write what I observe, she said. That's all I know how to do. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the passage about the lake. The things I told you there. She had written it carefully. She looked at him. "It's true," he said. "It's exactly true." He paused. I did not know until I read it that I had wanted someone to write it down, to put it in the record. He was quiet. "Thank you." She looked at her breakfast, then at him. Then she said, in the old dialect, the word for a thing built from something you did not ask for, that became worth having. He said it back to her. Then the word for two things, becoming legible to each other. Then the word for choosing with full knowledge. She said all three back, correctly, without error. He looked at her with that full specific attention, the one she had known since the first night in the clearing, the one that was not detachment, but its opposite, the quality of someone entirely present to you, without wanting anything from you except what you chose to give. The spring continued outside. The territory made its annual argument toward green. The oldest yew counted its centuries. The lake held the sky. In the library with its two sets of shelves and its fire, and its accumulated evidence of two people existing simultaneously in a shared space, something that had started with a dare and a correctly spoken name continued to be exactly what it was. Chosen, honest, and entirely real. The book was published in October. She held the first copy in the library where she had first understood what the territory was, standing in the same spot where she had turned slowly and looked at 40,000 volumes, and felt, for the first time, the full scope of what she had walked into. The cover was simple. Her name. The title. A photograph of the tree line at dusk, the boundary visible if you knew what to look for. Cadron stood at the far end of the library. He had been there when the courier arrived, had watched her unwrap the package, was watching her now hold the thing that had taken 8 months and 7 months before that, and a lifetime of preparation she had not known was preparation. She brought it to him. He took it carefully, opened it to the dedication page. She had not shown him the dedication. He read it. His expression did the thing it did when he was receiving something that required the full capacity of 300 years of learning to feel things without being destroyed by them. The dedication said, "For the territory, and for the one who tends it, and for Priya, who made the dare." He closed the book. Held it. She waited, he said, in the old dialect, a word she had not heard before. She looked at him. "What is that one?" He was quiet for a moment. In old usage, he said, it refers to the specific moment when something you have been building is finally complete. He paused, when you can see that it is exactly what it was meant to be, and nothing could be added or removed. She looked at the book in his hands. "Is that what this is?" she asked. "No," he said. She looked up. "That word applies to fixed things," he said. "Things that are finished." He looked at her directly. "What we have is not that word." He said another word, one she knew, the one for two things still in the process of becoming legible to each other. "Still becoming," she said. "Yes." He handed the book back to her. He held her gaze with the full quality of his attention. Always still becoming. She held the book and looked at him and thought about the 11 months since the dare, about what had been built in that time and what was still being built, and the specific quality of something that had no end point, because the point was the ongoing. She looked at the book. At the dedication, at her name on the cover. She had written, in the chapter about the first night in the clearing, about the feeling of standing on the boundary between two worlds, and not being afraid. She had written it as an observation, and now she understood it was also a choice she had been making continuously for 11 months, every morning when she walked to the library, and every evening when she stayed, and every session of the dialect lessons, and every conversation that was not research, but was more important than research. "Not afraid," she said. "That's still true." He said, "I know." The fire in the library was doing what it always did. The books on their shelves were doing what they always did. Through the spelled windows, the territory was moving through October in the way she had now watched it move through every season, each one teaching her something about what it meant to belong to a place rather than just inhabit it. She put the book on her shelf, the two shelves that were hers, that had started as one and become two as the months accumulated. She stood looking at the spines, at the notebooks with their dense phonological notation, at the slim volume of untranslatable poetry worn smooth from handling. She turned around. He was still at the far end of the library, watching her with the attention that had been the first thing she had understood about him and was still the truest. She said his name. Correctly, the way she had been saying it for 11 months, with the vowel length and consonant weight and the meaning underneath the sound. Kadrin. He crossed the library, stopped in front of her. His hand came up and touched her face in the way she had learned, the way that was always offered rather than taken. She covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand and held hers. Outside, October moved through the territory. The U continued its long accounting. The lake at the eastern edge held the sky in its perfect reversal. Sophie walked the ecosystem boundary with her clipboard. Remy worked on something in the east wing, the steady sound of it carrying through the residence. The forest made its quiet adjustments to the late afternoon. Inside, in the library where the evidence of a shared life was arranged on two sets of shelves and a fire burned in the grate, two people stood in the ordinary, extraordinary present tense of something that had started with a dare and a name said correctly and had become, through 11 months of honest accumulation, the most real thing in either of their lives. She thought about the word for two things still becoming legible to each other, about how it had no fixed endpoint, about how that was not a limitation. "Tell me something in the old dialect," she said. "Something I haven't learned yet." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said a word she had not heard. A sound like depth made audible, like something choosing its own weight. She listened to the shape of it, repeated it back. Wrong, he corrected the middle syllable. She tried again. "Closer," he said. She said it again. "Yes," he looked at her. "Like that." "What does it mean?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then the condition of being exactly where one is meant to be. Not arrived. Not finished. Present, he said. Fully and without reservation. Here, she held the word, turned it over the way she turned all the words, feeling for the shape of it, the weight, the specific information it carried that nothing in any other language quite replicated. She said it again. "Yes," he said. Exactly, she wrote it in her mind. She would write it in both journals later, in the phonological notation and in plain language, in the column where she kept the words that carried more than they seemed to. In the library with the fire and the books and the October territory moving through its changes outside, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not arrived. Not finished. Here,